take it away, please, Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. And yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I warn you that I can't see you, so please just shout at me if stuff is breaking. Cool. So yes, I want to talk about imagination in augmented reality and virtual reality, and in particular in the kind of perception of augmented reality and virtual reality. So just a kind of brief plan of the talk. So I'll give a little bit of background as to the kind of virtual realist versus fictionalist positions. Thankfully, this is the perks of being last. I think a lot of this stuff has kind of already been said, so that's great. Hopefully everyone's very familiar with them by now. Then I want to talk a bit about imagination in AR and VR perception. I'll distinguish a couple of different types of cases that we come across, which maybe merit slightly different treatment. I then want to give an argument against imagination as involved in just the perception of augmented and virtual reality, before concluding with maybe some other ways in which imagination might well be involved in augmented and virtual reality. So we shouldn't wholly give up on the fictionalist position. Okay, so just a very brief kind of overview of the kind of two main options to this question: do virtual objects exist? So as we've heard, some people say yes, virtual objects are real digital objects. Digital objects exist as bits and bytes of computers. Alternatively, we can answer no. We can say that they're merely fictional, or we can possibly say they're just illusory. So I'm going to mostly focus on the fictionalist position today. I'm not going to talk too much about the realist, although it will come up a couple of times, or the illusionist position. And I think this kind of dichotomy of are virtual objects fictional, or are they real, or maybe kind of non-fictional, I guess, seems to be quite a natural one. It seems to be really quite significant for how we engage with lots of different forms of media, whether they're fiction or non-fiction. So just a kind of brief example, you know, if I flick on the TV and I see loads of kind of sirens in front of the Houses of Parliament, how do I react? Well, it depends, right? It depends whether I think I'm watching BBC News or TV drama. I'll react very differently depending on what I think I'm watching. So, and I think the same goes for written fictions as well. Whether we think we're reading a newspaper or fan fiction or something, right? It changes how we react to reading something. So it clearly matters for our engagement with many pieces of media, whether they're fiction or non-fiction. So then a key question obviously is that, okay, so well, what makes something fiction rather than non-fiction? And one quite influential view is that there's at least some link between fiction and the imagination, or make-believe, or pretense, or something like that, right? And in particular, one very influential view that we've come across already in each of the previous talks is Kendall Walton's. So works of fiction are works whose function is to serve as props in games of make-believe. And so essentially fiction is something that kind of prescribes us to imagine things. So just to give an example, so a classic piece of great literature, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, it prescribes you to imagine that the caterpillar ate through one nice green leaf. It contains this sentence, and so, you know, when I'm reading it, it kind of prescribes me to imagine this. And we've also, just a quick caveat, we've also kind of seen this caveat a little bit in Nathan's talk, that this idea of kind of Walt fiction, as some people call it. This Walton's account of fiction seems far too wide, right? Lots of things prescribe us to imagine things which don't seem like we would ordinarily call them fiction. Just a brief example, so a vivid description of a historical event in a biography, or plausibly that kind of prescribes us to imagine what it was like to be there, maybe. It seems like that might be what this particular passage is intended to do, but we wouldn't then place the biography in the fiction section of the bookshop, right? So prescribing to imagine things is going to capture a far wider category than what we'd ordinarily call fiction. So hence, well, some people call this kind of Walt fiction instead. And this is kind of how virtual fictionalists couch their view. You know, they say they're kind of virtual Walt fictionalists, and say that it's part of this wider category. rather than being part of kind of literary fiction or anything like that. Okay, so virtual fictionalism, augmented reality and virtual reality are fiction since they kind of prescribe us to imagine things. So just to run through a few examples that Neil and Nathan give in their paper. So this is in an experience called Sansar, so it's kind of a VR experience. And they say, we're in this experience, we're prescribed to imagine various things. So first, that kind of we see this. So I'm gonna use this top right Shrek image to kind of stand in for what we see in VR. I couldn't find a better one, but hopefully, imagine that's it. Shrek's in VR, and we're kind of looking at this image. So we imagine of this image of a large green ogre-looking thing that it's a 3D entity. Second, if the text of an English sentence preceded by, I'm not even going to try and say that, appears in the window in the bottom right, then imagine that the ogre uttered the relevant sentence. Okay, so there's some kind of text in the bottom of the window. You kind of meant to imagine that the ogre's saying that. And if we're prescribed to imagine that the ogre uttered something, then imagine that Nathan, whose avatar the ogre thing is, said it. So virtual objects end up being fictional because they're prescribed to be imagined. The large green ogre doesn't really exist. There's just a kind of projected image, and we imagine that the image is a large green ogre. Okay, and then kind of the contrasting position, virtual realism, says something different about whether imagination is involved in virtual reality and augmented reality as well. So I'll just read out this quick quote from Chalmers about the role of imagination in VR. So he says, fictionism is a coherent view. It certainly covers some virtual worlds. It covers the virtual worlds of role-playing video games, which essentially involve fictions and a certain sort of pretense. Maybe it captures some users' attitude towards non-video game virtual worlds when these users experience them via attitudes of pretense that they are in a physical world with the same features. And this is next bit is the key bit, but I don't think that make-believe is essential to the experience of virtual reality. Now, this has to be quite a strong claim. It can't just be the claim that, oh, well, you can interact with virtual reality without make-believe or imagination, right? So fictionists are saying that in VR, we're prescribed to imagine, not that they necessarily always do. The idea is kind of that to properly engage with virtual reality, we must imagine and compare that with literature, right? So I can read War and Peace as if it were a factual account, but that's not really the right thing to do, right? I'm kind of prescribed to make believe, even though I can engage with it wrongly by just believing everything that it says. So virtual realists are going to need the kind of stronger claim that in VR, we're not prescribed to imagine, or similarly in AR, we're not prescribed to imagine. Okay, so we've kind of got this key question. So is imagination involved in VR and AR? And I think imagination is quite a kind of nebulous term. Let's see if we can kind of pin it down a bit more precisely in order to kind of evaluate this. So people often distinguish kind of two types of imagination, propositional imagination. So I kind of imagine that an evil demon is deceiving me, and sensory or imagistic imagination, or as other people call it, kind of mental imagery. So I kind of picture in my head the various dishes on the menu if I want to decide what I want to order, say. And this seems like a kind of a quite good distinction. These seem like different mental processes that we ought to distinguish. I also think that there's this kind of third type of imagination, which I'll talk about quite a bit in this talk, and I'll kind of represent it with this red color and blue color of the text, and kind of de re imagination. So we kind of imagine of something that it is otherwise. So I can imagine, so think about the image at the top right of the screen. I imagine of the cloud that it's a rabbit. So you can kind of take that image and you imagine of the cloud that it's a rabbit. And sometimes this seems kind of like sensory imagination, right? I kind of visualize one object as an instance of another object. Sometimes it doesn't really seem quite so sensory. It kind of is almost like kind of pretending. It kind of is about how we treat something. So to give a very Waltonian example, I might imagine a clump of mud as a pie during a game of mud pies. And here, what I'm doing is I'm kind of treating the mud as if it were a mud pie, or as if it were a pie, sorry. And this maybe seems slightly less sensory, but but I'll come back to these two different types in a bit. But I think the key thing here is just this de re imagination. I imagine of something that it's something else. Okay, and so now let's look back at these cases that the fictionalist gives and think, okay, so what kind of imagination is involved in these cases? So the first one, imagine that this projected image of a large green ogre-looking thing is a fully 3D entity. This seems like de re imagination. We kind of imagine of the image that it's a 3D ogre. The second one, so in this case, we kind of imagine of the sentence preceded by, again, I'm not going to try and say it, Goldblag, I guess, that the ogre uttered it. And finally, this third one, I think, is again going to be de re. So we imagine of a sentence that the ogre uttered, that Nathan said it. This third one's a little bit weird. In the previous two cases, we kind of, well, this third one seems kind of derivative. This third case seems derivative on the second case. The thing we're imagining of is kind of something within the fiction itself. In the first two cases, we literally see the image, we literally see the sentence, we imagine of them. In the third case, we're imagining of a sentence the ogre uttered. Well, that's kind of derivative on two. So it's maybe slightly more complicated case, but still roughly the same kind of thing going on. And I'm mostly going to focus on the first case, where it looks like maybe imagination is involved in augmented and virtual reality perception. I'll talk a little bit more about the second and the third case right at the end of the talk. I'll come back to those. But let's just focus on the first one for now. Okay, so here's what the fictionist says. We kind of imagine of the image that it's a 3D ogre. And I think there's almost two different ways that we can be fictionalists here, right? So there's a kind of perceptual way. First, we could say our perception of augmented and virtual reality is governed by some kind of prescription to imagine. And what it is to be fictional or world fictional is to be prescribed to imagine stuff. And so AR and VR are fictional. And here it's kind of, we imagine of our kind of perception of the image that it's perception of a 3D ogre. So I'll say a bit more about this in a minute. An alternative road to fictionalism is more of a kind of engagement way of getting to fictionalism. So our kind of engagement with AR and VR, and non-perceptual engagement, I should say, is governed by prescriptions to imagine. Again, hence AR and VR are fictional. And this is more with this kind of second sense of de re imagining. We kind of treat the image of an ogre as if it were a kind of 3D ogre. And I want to kind of argue against this first road to fictionalism. And I'll say a little bit about why it might seem quite plausible in a minute. Okay, but first I think it's worth thinking about some of the empirical work that's been done on virtual reality in particular, regarding the imagination. And it's interesting, right, in that especially VR research very, very rarely mentions the imagination at all. And when it is mentioned, it's usually in contrast to virtual reality as a kind of method of treating psychological disorders. So the place it comes up loads is treatment of anxiety disorder. Traditionally, the treatment involved patients, or at least one form of treatment involved patients kind of imagining anxiety-provoking scenarios. An alternative method of treating anxiety disorder is now to kind of place people in these situations using virtual reality. And so there's been various kind of studies on kind of comparing the two methods and so on. And there's this real contrast between, oh, well, you kind of mentally imagine it on the one hand, or you could kind of be placed in it in virtual reality. And this kind of seems quite interesting. It doesn't really tell us much about whether imagination is actually involved in virtual reality, though. It seems to me like this is more saying that, I mean, AR and VR seem quite similar here to something like film, in contrast to literature. So in literature, you kind of read and then you have the mental imagery. Or at least most people do, as was mentioned in the Q&A just now. Some people have aphantasia and don't, but commonly people kind of read and then have the mental imagery. Whereas in film and AR and VR, you kind of see what's happening there right in front of you, rather than needing to kind of form some kind of mental imagery. Ultimately, I don't think this tells us too much, but this is one place where imagination gets mentioned a lot. And I think it's quite an interesting contrast case. Another really interesting study was again examining subjects' mental images, and it was kind of found this kind of correlation between people's ability, mental imagery ability, and a kind of higher reported sense of presence in VR. So presence is kind of like feeling like you're really there, even when you know you're not. So again, this maybe seems like a case where one imaginative ability is kind of correlated with this further presence ability in VR. So you think, okay, so maybe imagination is also involved in presence. Maybe, but it doesn't really seem like the right kind of case for our purposes here. It doesn't really seem like a perceptual case. So presence, kind of feeling like you're really there, not really anything to do with perception. You know, maybe imagination is involved in presence. Virtual realists will disagree. They'll say, oh, it's not. But again, this doesn't really quite seem like the right type of case for our purposes here. We're interested in, is imagination involved in VR perception? This looks like a non-perceptual case. Okay, so let me turn to a kind of more philosophical argument for that imagination is involved in VR perception. So I've kind of reconstructed this out of various kind of things that Walton says, and in particular, I'm drawing from his work on depictions here to try and give this kind of perceptual route to fictionalism. And so the idea is this. So first we're saying AR and VR seem like they're depictions, you know, they're, whilst they have this kind of appearance of motion, really ultimately they're kind of static images that, you know, maybe there's 240 kind of images per second, but they're kind of static images. They seem roughly similar to other images. Then we're just going to take some Waltonian premises. So we're going to take Walton's idea of fiction. So Walt fiction is something that functions as a prop in a game of make-believe, you know, serves to prescribe us to imagine things. We're going to take this third premise, which is something that Walton says, which some people thought was a bit weird, but which is that all depictions have the function of serving as props in games of make-believe. All depictions kind of prescribe us to imagine things. And I'll talk more about this because I think this is potentially where the argument might go wrong. But if we accept 2 and 3, then we get the conclusion which Walton endorses, which is that all depictions are fiction. And if we say that AR and VR are depictions, then we get the result that AR and VR are also Walt fiction. So, I mean, premise 2, you know, if we're saying that if it's just about Walt fiction, then that's just how Walt fiction is defined. So kind of, that's fine. I want to restrict one a bit. I'll just talk about that in a second, because I think saying that all AR and VR depictions might be a bit too wide. But I think the main problem here is with premise 3. So I'll come back around and talk about that. In particular, I'll say that AR and VR, if they're depictions at all, are not depictions that prescribe imagining. Okay, so we can kind of model what the fictionalist said about VR and kind of apply it over to AR, right? So we can give a similar kind of fictionalist analysis of Pokemon Go here. So in this case, you're kind of prescribed to imagine of the Snorlax image, so the image on the phone, that it is a 3D Snorlax. So that's very similar to what we said about the ogre, the large green ogre earlier. And this seems kind of natural, right? I have kind of, so when I'm using AR or like Pokemon Go, I have kind of one attitude towards the real elements and a different attitude towards the kind of augmented elements. And this is like a realistic fiction, like War and Peace. I have one attitude of belief towards the factually true bits and another imagination towards the fictionalized bits. Kind of seems about right. But this doesn't really capture other cases. And I'm going to call these kind of overlay cases. So take the image on the right. On the kind of previous model, if we just apply that across, then we're kind of meant to imagine, so if you see the little kind of 80% task completion circle thing on the left-hand side, if we apply this across just straightforwardly, then we're kind of meant to imagine of this little widget thing that it's some kind of like task completion board floating in the air. And obviously that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like I'm kind of imagining and engaging with this AR that there is some kind of little floating board up in the air. it kind of functions more like an overlay rather than anything depicted within the scene itself, right? So compare the case. So Snorlax looks like Snorlax is meant to be within the scene itself, standing next to the man. In this case, the task completion bar isn't really being depicted within the scene. It's kind of like an overlay, or kind of part of the HUD, as people sometimes say for video games. And so we've got these kind of two cases. So on the left, we have these depictive cases where objects are kind of depicted within the environment. And on the right, we have these kind of, as I call them, overlay cases, where, you know, in the glasses case on the right-hand side, the 61 degrees, that's not kind of being depicted within the scene. It's kind of on the surface. It's part of the overlay. As I say, I'm not quite sure whether this is absolutely cut and dry. I'd be interested to hear if anyone has thoughts on this or whether there are in-between cases. But let's just keep it simple for now, depictive overlay cases. Okay, and we have the same for VR as well. So on the left, we have depictive cases in VR where kind of the objects are depicted within the scene. And on the right, we have more kind of overlay cases where, you know, these parts are kind of part of the overlay or the HUD. I'm not even sure whether they constitute virtual objects at all. Arguably not. So okay, but and most cases will contain a mixture, I should say. So you know, on the left-hand case, you know, there's a car that's kind of a depicted aspect, and there's all this overlay stuff like kind of lap time indicator, the speed gauge at the bottom right, etc. And so I kind of just want to focus on these depictive aspects and kind of let's just put to one side these overlay aspects, which seem at least more complicated. Okay, so we had this perceptual road to fictionalism, which said that AR and VR are depictions. I now want to kind of amend that. So just the depictive aspects of AR and VR are depictions. So we're kind of ignoring this overlay stuff. Maybe they're not depictions. It's more complicated, but just these depictive aspects. Okay, so now let's think, okay, so now does the argument work? Okay, well, I think 3 is still going to be the potentially problematic bit. And to do this, we're going to have to dive into Walton's theory of depiction. So Walton has what might seem to be quite a strange view of depiction. So sorry, just to jump back. So Walton says all depictions are fiction, right? And that seems kind of odd when you first hear it. And then you think, okay, well, it's only Walt fiction, but it's still kind of strange to say that. And so Walton's saying that when we're engaging with the depiction, what we're doing is we're kind of imagining of our perception that it is, sorry, of our perception of a kind of flat image or of the canvas, or in this case, on the image on your screen, which depicts a canvas, which depicts a mill, that it is seeing a mill. And this is different to the kind of imagination that goes on when we engage with literature, for instance, right? So with literature, we kind of read a description of a character and we have some kind of mental imagery, maybe. In depictive art, instead, we literally see something and we imagine of that seeing that it is seeing the kind of the real thing. So in it kind of with our perception of depictive images, this is this kind of de re imagination again. We imagine of our perception that it is otherwise. Okay, so a kind of Waltonian view of the depictive aspects of AR and VR we've seen says that kind of we imagine of our seeing the image that it is seeing a 3D ogre. And similarly, we imagine of our seeing the Snorlax image that it is seeing a 3D Snorlax, right? So this is kind of applying the classic Waltonian stuff on depiction to these VR and AR cases. The question is this really the right way to account for depiction, both generally and in particular in AR and VR, right? And I mean, I think this is an open question whether it's right generally, but I'm going to argue that for AR and VR in particular, I don't think it is the correct view. So I mean, first there's a kind of phenomenological objection. Like it just doesn't feel like I'm imagining of my perception when I view depictive images. But I mean, that's fairly surface level. As Adrian mentioned, you know, perhaps these kind of imaginings become so automatic that maybe we don't even realize that we're doing it. As Nathan mentioned as well, you know, if AR becomes really widespread, again, maybe we just don't realize that we're imagining. It just becomes so automatic. Okay, but still, it still feels like putting this in terms of imagination might seem like a bit of a stretch. It might seem like, rather than perceiving an image and imagining of the perception that it is perceiving an actual deer, maybe there's just a simpler solution. And there are different views on this. I mean, I think the reason for bringing the imagination in at all is there's this kind of gap in image perception, right? So on the one hand, we kind of perceive a flat surface, right? That's what we kind of directly perceive. And we kind of have this indirect perception of some kind of depicted 3D object. And imagination seems to me to be, well, for Walton, to kind of bridge this gap, right? So, there's our literal perception of a 2D image, and we kind of imagine of it that it is perception of a 3D deer, right? So we can do it in terms of imagination to kind of bridge this gap, but I mean, there are alternatives as well. I mean, there are many views of depiction. I mean, just one here, Richard Wollheim, on twofoldness. So he again talks about there's this kind of two different things involved in perception. So I'm kind of aware of the 2D looking surface itself, but also I can see in the deer, in this case, a 3D object. So we need not have imagination necessarily, although it does look like one way of maybe bridging this gap. So imagination looks like one way of bridging the gap. The worry I have with this is that this doesn't quite seem to be similar enough to the cases of AR and VR, right? AR and VR seem a lot more like different types of images. In particular, I think they seem like these trompe-l'oeil images, right? So in these cases, so again, this is slightly misleading because I'm presenting it and you're actually seeing an image. So but imagine that you're actually seeing the bus itself here, or you're actually seeing I'm not sure what to call it, iceberg street on the bottom left. In these cases, you kind of see a depth that isn't really there, and there's been much philosophical discussion of these images. Wollheim says they aren't depictions at all, which is kind of interesting. But these seem like a really interesting case on which to model perception of AR, especially, and maybe VR too. The reason for that is because, think about these, especially the snake bus and iceberg street. Those seem like they could well be AR or VR kind of apps, right? You can imagine an app where you kind of point the camera at the street and it creates this iceberg. It seems like that's very, very similar to what's going on in AR. And similarly with Snake Bus, you can imagine an app, you point it at things and there's a snake kind of surrounding it. These seem like really similar cases where kind of additional objects are kind of added on top of what's really there. Okay, so what's going on with these kind of trompe-l'oeil perception? What's going on with perception in these cases? I mean, perhaps Walton's right. Imagination is involved in the perception of regular images, right? Maybe it's needed to kind of bridge this gap. Like we see this flat surface, but you also see some 3D objects. So we kind of need imagination to bridge the two. Maybe we don't. Maybe we can do it with seeing in. But these images, trompe-l'oeil images, seem like they just don't have this gap altogether, right? Because we don't really see this flat surface at all in these cases. We kind of see them kind of directly in 3D. We see them as in our egocentric space, as kind of spatially related to us. So just a quick example of this. Actually, I probably should have included this, but some of the earliest trompe-l'oeil images were kind of Greek painters painting grapes that were so realistic that birds would come and try to eat them, right? Birds kind of really perceive them as being really there. And I think, similarly, these trompe-l'oeil images, we don't really see them as images. Again, it's misleading because I'm giving you images of them. But if you imagine actually seeing the kind of the iceberg street, as I've called it, you kind of really see it as 3D. And it's often only kind of context or style that makes us realize that what we perceive is not really there. There probably aren't icebergs in the middle of the street or a huge snake constricting a bus. That's probably not what's actually happening, but perceptually it might seem to us that way at first. So I think these are really good models for AR and VR. Obviously, in these cases, the images are moving rather than static, as in most trompe-l'oeil images. But in AR and VR, we similarly don't really perceive this kind of flat surface, and also perceive this 3D aspect where we need to kind of bridge the two. I think similarly in AR and VR, there's this kind of direct perception of the kind of 3D-ness of them. I mean, I'll add a quick caveat. Occasionally, I think we do perceive a flat surface in AR and VR. So imagine the lens of your VR or the screen of your phone is scratched or something, then maybe you're kind of aware of the flat surface while also seeing a kind of 3D object within it. But I think these cases are kind of atypical. I think for the most part, when you put on VR goggles, you're kind of directly seeing it as 3D. I mean, it's the same with kind of 3D glasses in film or something like that. You see it as kind of directly in your egocentric space, and you don't kind of perceive this flat image. And hence, there's potentially no need to appeal to imagination in these cases, in the perception of such images. Okay, so here's the kind of initial fictionalist claim we imagine of the image that it's a 3D ogre. I've said, well, maybe not. In these kind of cases, they seem more like trompe-l'oeil images. We kind of just perceive a 3D ogre, right? We don't really kind of perceive an image, imagine that it's an ogre. We just straight perceive a 3D ogre. This isn't to say there is a 3D ogre, right? I mean, we could be realists and say, yes, okay, we perceive a digital object, but we could be illusionists, say, we perceive something that doesn't exist. I perceive a mirage in a desert. That doesn't mean there is one, right? But whichever view we go for, I think we need not appeal to imagination here. I can see the kind of following fictionalist response. We didn't really mean that we imagine of seeing the image, that it's seeing a 3D ogre. We just meant we kind of imagine of the image that it's a 3D ogre. In a kind of more non-perceptual sense, we kind of interact with the image as if it were an ogre. And I think that sounds a lot fairer. Perhaps we do interact with the image this way. But this is kind of different road to fictionalism, right? So I've been arguing against this kind of perceptual road to fictionalism, which all comes from Walton on depiction. And fictionalists want to be Walt fictionalists. I wonder whether this aspect of what Walton says potentially doesn't lead to fictionalism in quite the same way. Maybe they need to focus more on this engagement road to fictionalism, where instead of kind of imagining of our perception, which is the perceptual road, we kind of engage with fictionalism. We engage with VR and AR in the sense that we kind of treat the image as a 3D ogre rather than imagining of our perception of it that it's of a 3D ogre. Okay, so this isn't really an argument against virtual fictionalism. It's more an argument against one way in which we might arrive at virtual fictionalism, this kind of perceptual road, which says that AR and VR prescribe us to imagine as part of our perception of virtual objects, just as Walton holds for depictions more generally. So I've kind of argued that, maybe Walton's right for most images, but AR and VR seem like they're more analogous to a particular type of image, kind of trompe-l'oeil images, which don't seem like they will be prescribing imagining because we kind of already directly perceive their contents. We don't see a 2D surface, we kind of imagine that it's 3D, we just straight see it in 3D. And hence AR and VR don't seem like they're fictional in virtue of their nature as depictions. So just to bring this back to the kind of perceptual road, so we kind of clarified the argument with these amended 1 and 5. I've argued that we should reject 3. So not all depictions kind of prescribe imagining. In particular, trompe-l'oeil images and ones like them don't seem like they prescribe imagining. I've put it this way, we could also alternatively just take this as a reason to say that these aspects of VR and AR aren't depictions at all. That would be another way to go. I mentioned that Woolheim says this. He says that trompe-l'oeil images just aren't depictions at all. And maybe we can say something similar and just say that the depictive aspects of AR and VR, they just aren't depictions at all. And hence the argument fails for that reason. So I think, we could take what I've said to either be reason for rejecting 3, or maybe we even go up a step and say the depictive aspects just aren't depictions of AR and VR, aren't depictions at all. So I'll just finish by saying a little bit about this alternative engagement road to fictionalism, because I think this is a lot more plausible, and this is more about the kind of second example, and actually the third example that Neil and Nathan give in their paper. So this is where we kind of see a English sentence at the bottom of the screen, and fictionalists say something like this. We kind of imagine of the sentence that the ogre uttered it. We also imagine of the sentence that the ogre uttered that Nathan said it, right? So, I could say something like Nathan said whatever the sentence was, on the basis of it appearing at the bottom of the screen, and this is why, because we kind of have this two-step process where we're imagining of the sentence that the ogre said it. We imagine that Nathan is the ogre, so Nathan said it. And this seems to be this kind of different engagement road to fictionalism. The way in which we engage with AR and VR prescribes imagining. And these kind of cases seem a lot more plausible to me, that imagination is involved in them. To engage with the VR program Sansar properly, arguably, Neil has to imagine that Nathan is the ogre. Nathan must imagine himself as the ogre, right? It seems like, very plausibly, imagination is much more important in these kinds of cases rather than these perceptual cases. But note that this is quite a different kind of imagination, right? This is kind of pretending or treating Nathan as the ogre. This is not any kind of mental imagery stuff or kind of sensory imagining where I kind of picture Nathan as an ogre. That's not quite what's going on. I'm just kind of treating the ogre as if, that is Nathan. This, again, seems like something we do rather than some kind of mental state or mental process. And I'll just finish with a few other cases where I think the fictionalists can make this kind of engagement case. So while I've argued that, maybe imagination isn't prescribed in the perceptual case, here are some non-perceptual cases where I think imagination is a lot more plausibly prescribed in AR and VR. So one case, we might be prescribed to empathize with virtual characters. We're kind of prescribed to imagine ourselves as them in order to kind of understand their reasoning, perhaps, just as we do according to various theories of mind for understanding other people in reality. A second case, so I mentioned the kind of phenomenon of presence earlier. This is a controversial one. Realists will say there's no imagination going on here, but perhaps imagination is going on when we kind of feel like we're somewhere else. We feel like we're in a different place. Maybe this is kind of imagining that we are, or maybe, as realists say, we actually are in a different digital location. But I think, it seems to me that maybe imagination is going on here as well. And finally, perhaps we're prescribed to imagine various kind of consequences of actions well, I can imagine this in VR especially, but possibly in AR too, where kind of, again, we're prescribed to imagine. So if all it takes for something to be a kind of woke fiction is to prescribe imagining, then these seem like the kind of cases that fictionalists will want to appeal to say that AR and VR are still woke fiction, and hence virtual objects will still be woke fictional. So I've just argued against this perceptual road to fictionalism. I think there's still, various other ways that we can argue for fictionalism, but I think we should focus much more on these kind of engagement cases rather than the kind of image cases that I've argued against. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's terrific. Well, as per normal, please send me your questions in the chat with a Q or a follow-up with a finger. I'll start with Fiona.
Thanks. I enjoyed that paper tremendously. Suppose I agreed with you that at least some cases of AR and VR are like Trompe l'oeil cases. I think cases where you're wearing a headset are like that. But let's set those cases aside. The case that you sort of discussed a lot at the start was a case where you've got your phone and you're, there's a Pokemon picture on it and it looks like your friend is standing beside the Pokemon or something. And I think that you're describing that case incorrectly, and in a way that if you just reflected on it a wee bit more, you would not describe it in this way. So you kind of say that you're sort of treating or imagining, I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but what you said is that you're treating the image as if it's the Pokemon, or you're treating the image as if it's the ogre. And I don't think in any sense you are, right? So when I've got my phone's in my hand and I can touch the image here, but I don't thereby think I'm touching the Pokemon that seems, when I look at my phone, to be beside my friend over there. So it's not that you treat the image as if it's the Pokemon, rather you treat the image as if it's a photograph or a video or something of a Pokemon that's out there in the world beside your friend. And I think that's quite an important kind of twist in how you describe that case. I think it's important to see that, and I think it will kind of have some repercussions for what you'll say of that case. But I also think when you describe it correctly, you'll see how it will be more obvious, perhaps, how different that case is to the VR and AR case where you're wearing goggles, and in no sense does there seem to you to be, you know, in the case of goggles, two images close up to your eyes that, as I would say, as a matter of fact, you are seeing, but it doesn't seem to you like you're seeing those. It seems to you like you're experiencing one three-dimensional object out there in the world.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so I don't know about the Pokemon case. So I was thinking, I mean, I'd want to say something like, you do in a sense treat the image like a Pokemon, in the sense that, so if I want to capture the Pokemon, I will throw a Pokeball at the image, right? So I'm kind of treating the image in a sense as if it is the Pokemon. So I don't know whether we.
The image seems to be in your hand, right? But the Pokemon doesn't seem to be in your hand. Your Pokemon seems to be, you know, a few feet in front of you, right? Mm. And you're taking that sort of ball that's, as a matter of fact, you know, there's a picture of a ball on the screen and you touch it and then you move it in the direction that the Pokemon seems to you that it would be in if it were as it is depicted in the screen, in the image. So yeah, I don't think you at all treat the image, you know, because suppose a Pokemon could bite you, right? You don't let go of your phone. You're not worried about hanging on to your phone. You're worried about getting away from the object that seems to be in front of you.
Okay, yeah, no, I see the point. So yeah, so the idea is more that rather than treating the image as the kind of the Pokemon in this case, so you're treating the image as an image, and so what's the better view of what's going on in this case then?
Well, when you see, you know, that picture that you had of your friend standing next to the Pokemon, right? And you see that on your phone, right? You don't think your friend is in your hand, right? You think your friend's out there, but you think you're seeing your friend in virtue of seeing the screen in front of you, which I would say you are. And it seems like it kind of seems to you as if you can treat the image on the screen as if that is a seeing of a Pokemon that's beside your friend, not a Pokemon in your hand.
Okay.
And I kind of think that's true of like the way you described cinema as well. Like I don't take it that the ogre is in the cine world in Glasgow. I take it that this is a video of some real world ogre that exists somewhere, maybe fairyland or in California or wherever it was shot, right? But there's not one in Glasgow.
Okay, I'm going to pause there and move on. We've got quite a long list of questions, so I'm going to fly the Be Rapid flag, and I'll come first to Nathan.
Cool. Thanks for that. That was great, Alex. Lots of questions. I guess one immediate kind of response to the objection to the perceptual route is actually a quote that was right at the very beginning of Adrian's talk. So Walton says something like breathing, imagination can be deliberate or spontaneous. So I don't see why we couldn't, or the Waltonian couldn't just say, yeah, no, it is spontaneous, and actually this is all imagining, and it's not really happening in any kind of deep and heavy-handed way. It's still imaginative, the perception going on here.
Yeah, I suppose it seems that the role for the imagination in depiction is to kind of take you from this depiction of a 2D image to what it looks like in 3D. And I just don't, well, So maybe this applies more to the kind of VR and kind of AR glasses case, perhaps, right? But in those cases, it seems to me that there isn't really this 2D image, or you don't perceive it as a 2D image so much. There's just no need to imagine of the 2D. Yeah, I don't know.
This might be connected back to what Fiona was kind of pushing you on, or it could be that actually what's going on here is something like a kind of immersiveness of the relevant prompt. Like it's just a really, really well done prompt, so that as soon as you engage with it, it's just forcing onto you the kind of imaginative actions that's prescribed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, if it's so well done, then why think it's imagining at all? Why not just perceive it for what it is, right? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think when the props are really realistic, you just perceive them as if, I don't know. I worry that would, seems to me no different to a case when you're really perceiving a real object. So why say it's, I don't know, why say it's a prop in that case too? I don't know.
Super. Okay. Next question from Adrian.
Thanks. That was fantastic. I try and be quick. So I wanted to stick up for the fictionalist response, where you said, what was the response? That we, so this was around the discussion of Walton's view of depiction, characterized as that, say, when encountering an image of a 3D ogre, we imagine of the image that it is a 3D ogre. You unpacked Walton's view as that we imagine that of seeing the image that it is seeing a 3D ogre, and it just wasn't clear to me that that really that's the right conception of the view. That couldn't it just be that we imagine of the image, of that image, perhaps specified with a perceptual demonstrative, but that we imagine of the image that it is a 3D ogre, and in that case, then you don't get into these worries about it being strange to think that we imagine of our experience that it's a different experience.
Yeah. Okay. But then so what does it come to imagine of that image that it's a 3D ogre? I mean, is that just more treating it as if it was a 3D ogre? Because I think I'm happy with that, right? Yeah. So you characterize that as somehow non-perceptual, that then when you imagine of the image that it's a 3D ogre. But I don't see why that's non-perceptual. So in Walton's, for instance, Elon Hasid has a kind of defense of Walton's view here, where he tries to show that this actually helps in characterizing twofoldedness. So when you're perceiving an image, right, a part of your perceptual experience is the 2D surface. Well, it's the flat surface, but it depicts a three-dimensional object. If you think of Walton as saying that the de-ray object of your imagination is this flat surface, right, that you imagine of that it's the 3D image, then you can see how your imagination helps to characterize both the role of the flat surface in your experience and the depicted object. Yeah. Okay. I just worry that the cases again of like VR and AR kind of glasses seem like cases where there just isn't that 2D perception at all, right? And so again, there's nothing to imagine of, really. You're kind of just seeing straight through it in a way. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's even. I agree that's different, but I guess in that case you're just aware that it's an image, even if you don't have the sort of two-foldedness situation that you have with paintings and
and such that don't have this the convincingness of trompe-l'oeil, you're still aware that it's an image, and your capacity to imagine what you're seeing as being different than it is comes in there. This is all.
All right, I better step in here. We've just got one last question from Alexandra, please.
Thanks a lot, Alex. So yeah, I have a quick question. So usually it seems to me that virtual fictionalists are happy to say that the props are the digital objects. It's the digital objects which serve as props in the games of make-believe. But in your talk, you seem to suggest that what fictionalists take as props are instead the 2D images that we perceive in our headsets. And my worry is that this claim might have some unfortunate consequences, because if let's say that some users with different headsets perceive different pictures, well, this might generate different fictional truths. If your screen displays everything in black and white, if my headset dysfunctions, and so on and so forth, we will have like different classes of fictional truths. And if you put this to the extreme, it will seem as if like each screen corresponds to a distinct fictional world. But if you say, as I think Nathan and Neil have said in their paper, that the prop is a digital object, you can accommodate the variation, right? Because the digital object remains the same. So I'm a bit unclear. I mean, I don't know. I would be curious to hear what you have to say on this. Like, how do you think the relation between the digital object and the picture itself?
Yeah, no. So I was thinking this with Nathan's talk as well, because yeah, why take the props to be the digital objects rather than the images, right? And yeah, possibly it's helpful for these kind of cross-play problems. But I mean, in the sense, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it matters all that much. It seems to me that there's going to be a really close relation between the digital objects and the image anyway. So I think you can kind of say that, well, we could take one to be a prop, or we could talk about the other one to be a prop. It's ultimately the same thing, right? So yeah, so I don't know whether it matters too much what we say the props are. I don't know. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm getting to your question up. But yeah, I think we could do either, I think.
Super.